Namaskar and good morning to all the esteemed participants. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the CII-19 Sustainability Summit. Delegates, you can access all summit-related information by scanning the QR code provided behind your badges. During the special plenary on the first day of the summit, the Honorable Minister for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Shri Bhupender Yadav, along with Mr. Sanjeev Puri, President of the Confederation of Indian Industry and Chairman and Managing Director of ITC Limited, unveiled a report titled Building Climate Resilience of the Indian Industry. This report, prepared by the CII-ITC Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development in collaboration with CEW, introduces a unified framework aimed at enhancing the climate resilience of industries. The session will highlight key findings and explore actions for government and industry to support national adaptation efforts. It is an honor to extend our heartfelt welcome to the session moderator to the dais. I request the moderator, Mr. Karthik Ganeshan, Fellow and Director, Strategic Partnership, CEW, to lead and commence the discussion.
Good morning, but before I begin, I think it's important that we actually hear what was actually presented in that report. Many of you may not have had the chance to read that because I think it was launched by the minister and the copies probably flew away. My colleague Vishwas will just come over and make a 8 to 10 minute presentation. We can reflect on that over the course of the conversation that we'll have with our panelists. I'll introduce them after Vishwas is done so that everybody can have the benefit of seeing it on big screen. Yeah? Thank you. Vishwas, over to you, please.
Good morning. I am Vishwas. I lead the climate resilience team at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and we are really happy that we could collaborate with CII on this important activity and develop this framework. So we are really happy to take your feedback and inputs in this physical risk assessment framework that we have developed. Yeah, so is there a pointer or anything that I can do? Yeah, so this project or this activity focused on how do we build resilience of Indian industry. And as we all are aware that various countries across the world are focusing on developing their national adaptation plans, which comprises of how do we assess the risks, physical risks across different sectors. And then of course industry is already facing so many challenges due to climatic extremes. So it also is imperative that we develop a special framework also to look at what kind of risks exist, but not to limit it only to that level, but also to look at what are the adaptation options that we have in front of us, what kind of enabler matrix we apply to these adaptation strategies, and then how do we take it to the level of implementation. So we are trying to cover all that in this report, and the report was launched yesterday. And I think the team also has shared the QR codes, which there are two types, and I will come to that later. So this is the complexity of what India is going through in terms of climatic extremes. The map on the left-hand side from 2021 study highlights that India is facing serious issues in terms of extreme events like floods, cyclones, and droughts. And the colors are depicting, the yellow colors depict drought proneness or drought prone areas, but it is very important to look at the black colored areas which are facing the extreme events, all three extreme events occurring in one place, like floods, droughts and cyclones. Now you might say that, okay, eastern coast of India has been cyclone prone for many years, but the recent studies also suggest that western coast of India has seen an increase of up to 52% in terms of tropical cyclones occurring in the Arabian Sea, which means that what we are currently seeing on the eastern coast in terms of complexity of extreme events is likely to also occur on the western coast. And we have all these megacities like Mumbai, which are likely to experience more risk in terms of that. Now, it is very interesting that look at Rajasthan from the map on the left, which is clearly showing its drought proneness, central Maharashtra, etc. Now look at the map on the right. This is from our study on Indian monsoons from earlier this year, where we studied what kind of changes Indian monsoon has seen in last 10 years in the recent decade compared to baseline of 30 years before that. Here you can see that Rajasthan, Gujarat and central Maharashtra has experienced the highest increase in terms of heavy rainfall days in last 10 years. So, I mean, this is just to put it out in the perspective that drought prone areas are also becoming flood prone, and there is a massive increase in terms of heavy rainfall days, and which we can very clearly see from the map. So this is not a projection data, this is not a modeling data, this is actual observation data that we have analyzed for past 10 years. Now on the basis of this, then how do we take it up further for analyzing the risks? So just let's look at some of the examples. I mean, this is a best case example from Panama Canal, which maybe most of you were following that time. So in 2023, the number of vessels that passed through Panama Canal reduced drastically. It not only impacted the supply chains, but also it kind of created a barrier between various regions, like say connection between North America and Europe and Northern Asia, directly impacting the trade between these regions. So this is a risk that we are dealing with in the current context in the global narrative. When we look at a national case study, this is also a very interesting case study from Taiwan, where it's all about prioritization. Do you prioritize your semiconductor industry over your rice cropping areas? Rice cropping, of course, very water intensive. Semiconductor industry, equally water intensive. Now, Taiwan government had to decide between these two. And then, of course, for various reasons, they chose semiconductor industry and diverted the water towards the industries, where it led to a loss of nearly 74,000 hectares of rice crop. And then you can see like in its livelihood impacts, etc. So this is a national case study from Taiwan. Now, when it comes to floods in Chennai, I mean, this is not only about 2015, but last year, this year, almost every year in last 10 years, we have been facing these kind of floods across various cities in India. And then, of course, the regions, the industrial units that are located in the urban centers are also exposed to urban flooding and then their impacts. So this is just to highlight the facts that so many impacts have been seen across the world, but also India is of course not an exception, and we are also equally facing these risks. Now, how do these impacts impact the Indian industries? So extreme events like flood, cyclone, heat stress and drought, which we have considered in this study, they impact the industries differently. Like, flooding causes waterlogging, supply chain interruptions, but also it causes damage to your intensive, expensive machinery, inventory, as well as various other things in terms of direct damage to the assets. Also, cyclones, which comes with very high intensity of wind, and I mean, just some statistics in terms of Biparjoy cyclone that occurred last year, it caused a damage of nearly 5,000 crore. And especially only this one event that occurred in Gujarat, and this was only in Kutch district. So you can imagine the level of losses the cyclones also bring. Heat stress. Of course, there have been various studies that highlight the reduced productivity and worker efficiency, etc. due to heat stress. I mean, it's obvious. We are all humans. If the environment is not really cool enough and ambient enough, we are not going to produce that much of level of efficiency. So we have to think about that as well. And drought, I mean, just an example that of course it leads to reduced agricultural productivity. Now comes the point that why industries should invest in adaptation. Of course, I mean, you are facing these risks. So it is very obvious that industries also need to enable themselves and really build their own capacity in order to invest and take action at their own level. And then there are these ways of doing it, like, risk mitigation of industries. If you have identified that, okay, your plants are getting flooded almost every other year, we are not going to wait for next 5 years for a policy level change that will bring in some mandates and then you are taking action. By that time, you would already incur so much of economic losses. And I mean, that becomes a challenge in order to accommodate these financial implications. So risk mitigation of industries is very important. Reduce financial losses and damage to industries. Of course, we have to think about our own inventory that gets damaged, and we have to think about the ways of dealing with it. Okay, if a raised platform is not going to work in our location, what is that alternative strategy that we can implement in order to reduce the losses? And there are several examples that we have looked into through the literature review that talks about very simple solutions that can be implemented at an individual industrial asset. That can really help in reducing the losses. Also, loss and damage. It is very important if, say, you are spending 2 crores each year just on flood mitigation, or even not even mitigation, on response after the flood has occurred. You have to consider that in your financial planning in order to consider that, how do you accommodate the increasing cost of these kind of strategies in the coming years. And that's why loss and damage assessment is very important, and informed decision making. So for this, especially, the industry should invest in adaptation. Now, in this study, we had these 3 objectives. One was, of course, to develop the risk assessment framework, that how exactly the industry can take it up for implementation, how do we assess the risks, but also to focus on adaptation. What is that enabler matrix? What is those criteria that we should apply in order to prioritize on from long list of adaptation solutions to short list of adaptation solutions? And at the same time, how do we strengthen the capacity of the industry stakeholders in order to understand what it means? I mean, many of you might be fairly aware of transitional risks, but physical risk is fairly complicated and needs a bit of contextual understanding, needs a bit of expertise that needs to be brought in order to assess the risk. So for this study, we decided to actually develop the framework and then pilot it in prioritized sectors. Say manufacturing, we have 2 subsectors, automobile and iron and steel in Tamil Nadu and Odisha respectively, agriculture and allied value chain, cereal and dairy in Maharashtra. Now we prioritize these sectors based on these 4 criteria: gross value added, its working capital, number of employees and wages of employees, and top ranking states and top ranking sectors were decided to go further. Now, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 2014 has published this risk assessment equation, where risk is equal to hazard into exposure into vulnerability, where vulnerability is a component of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. In simpler terms, hazard is any extreme event that is likely to occur. Exposure, whatever is exposed to that event, may it be an industrial unit, may it be your people, etc. Sensitivity, if your asset is already located on say a slopey area or a high altitude area where there is problem of water scarcity or which is prone to landslides, it's likely to face some challenges. And adaptive capacity, whether you have accounted for all of this in your business continuity plans or not. These kind of indicators we have included in this equation. And that's how we have been able to develop this 5-step approach. So first one is to identify key climatic risks. So this is a 5-step approach. Step 1, key climatic risks. Step 2 is indicator selection. Step 3 is data collection. Step 4 is actually doing the physical risk assessment. And this is just a glimpse of the indicators. You will actually see much more detail in the report as well. And then step 5 is identifying and prioritizing adaptation options. Now, we conducted several consultations across the country and also to take the feedback on the initial level of framework, to also present the findings to the different stakeholders from these 3 states. And then also we asked the states, stakeholders to map their locations on the maps. So this is very quickly, I will explain how adaptive capacity plays a role in increasing or decreasing the level of risk. Now, this is a case of Jagatsinghpur and Bhadrak cluster from Odisha, where you see hazard, exposure, and sensitivity are pretty much in the same ranges, but adaptive capacity, and then the left-hand side column shows how many different actions Jagatsinghpur cluster has implemented in terms of developing SOPs for early warning systems, also having cooling shelters for employees, elevated platforms for machinery, etc., which are indicated in green color. And then that's why the score of Jagatsinghpur came to close to 0.079, whereas all of these things really lacked in the cluster of Bhadrak, and that's why the score is almost half. So with addition of all these scores, then we see that the Jagatsinghpur is in very low risk, versus Bhadrak is in somewhat moderate risk, but this is just a comparison of 2 sites to give you an example of how the calculation goes. Also, industry expressed that it's still at an early stage of quantifying or understanding what a risk means. There is a need for collective expertise sharing and collective action, but also it is very important that we establish a business case for adaptation. Otherwise, industries are not going to invest in it. We have to come out with that cost benefit analysis or return on investment analysis for what adaptation option works, what is the cost involved, and how much of averted loss it has been able to manage. Also, industry is looking for some regulatory support and policy guidelines in order to implement it. This is just a list of different adaptation strategies that we have listed. And we presented this in detail, and then through the consultations, we conducted a survey where the industry stakeholders ranked these adaptation strategies. So just one example from industrial management, there are 6 activities, out of which the industry stakeholders ranked them on the scale of impact and feasibility. And we can see that more or less all of them fall in the range of moderate to high range of impact and feasibility. But it is important to note that number 4 and number 3, implementing ecosystem management and developing emergency or contingency plan, ranks a bit higher, which identifies that, okay, these are the low-hanging fruit which can be implemented immediately, and industry understands that it is easier to implement those, but at the same time, their impact is also very high. Similarly, we have done it for all 5 categories of adaptive capacity. Now, based on the study, we have identified 3 goals. And in these 3 goals, there are recommendations for the industry as well as there are recommendations for policymakers. And in goal 1, we want to focus on strengthening the capacity for reporting physical risks. For that, industry is recommended to implement physical climate risk assessment framework that is developed in the collaboration, in this collaborative effort, but also to assess and incorporate your financial impacts that you are bearing in terms of financial implications due to extreme events. Policymakers, we recommend that the policymakers should look into developing an open access dashboard or open access utility that will provide at least up to district level data on extreme events. So the industry can access that open access tool, get the access to the data for their industrial units and implement the framework very easily. But also at the same time, it is important that the government focuses on mainstreaming this risk assessment frameworks on the line of India's National Adaptation Plan. And RBI came up with a financial disclosure framework earlier this year, which mandates regulated entities to disclose on the risks in 4 categories. On the same lines, Indian industry should also look into developing voluntary mechanism of reporting the physical risks. Goal 2 focuses on building capacity to future-proof these Indian industry units against the physical risks. So for that, of course, we recommend that large industries should conduct site-level assessments of these risks so that they can plan for also futuristic planning in terms of adaptation. And for government, of course, we recommend that investing in satellite technology, weather monitoring stations, and recently Ministry of Earth Sciences has launched Mission Mausam, under which the government is going to implement various Doppler weather radars across the country, and which is a 2,000 crore worth investment. But we feel that that really will bring a lot of new knowledge and new data sets at granular scale from which industry can also get benefited. Also AI and ML, and yesterday Mr. Puri also highlighted the role of AI in planning for adaptation, and we also recommend that we should harness that potential. In the goal 3, we focus on creating enabling environment. I mean, we can plan for all these things, but if there is no enabling environment for the industry to take up these recommendations, it's going to be a big challenge. So we promote, we suggest that the industry should invest in flood barriers, wind-resistant infrastructure. I mean, these are just some examples. But also, they should look into worker rotation mechanisms, staggering working hours, in order to deal with this heat stress and its impacts. But at the same time, there are various insurance products that are available in the market, and the industry can also have a discussion with the insurance industry as well, that if there could be a scope for developing new and innovative products that the industry can avail, especially focusing on extreme events, and climate resilient infrastructure for water and power. And now this is very interesting. We have recommended the policymakers to establish green and climate resilient industrial parks. And on the same lines, Tamil Nadu is already taking up an activity to plan for industrial resilience. And in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh in 2015 and 2016, and I think GIZ supported that activity, where they have conducted a climate change adaptation study for industrial parks in these 2 states. So it's not difficult. It has been already done in the past. So there is an opportunity for the government to take it up. Also, IRDAI could introduce guidelines for enabling the industries to take up the insurance products and innovative insurance products. Now, resource allocation and cluster, cluster development is also one of the recommendations. And for that, I think we all understand that MSMEs are smaller players in this sector, and they have very limited capacity in terms of financial capacity as well as decision-making, authority. So they should be focused on helping MSMEs to tackle these impacts, and there could be special mechanisms, special schemes that can promote more resilience building activities. Also, on the lines of climate finance taxonomy that is being planned by Ministry of Finance this year, MOFCC could also come up with climate change adaptation taxonomy, which can identify what falls in adaptation, and that can help industry also to plan for the projects. There could be some soft loans, there could be some subsidies that could be availed on adaptation projects. And of course, government should establish dedicated legal entities to resolve climate insurance related disputes and expedite claims. So with that, I will just come to an end. So now this is to collect responses from you. We have 3 questions, and I think there is that A4 size QR code on all the tables. So please scan that QR code, and there are 5 questions on which we just need a ranking from your side. So I request all of you to please scan that, or also please scan it from the screen. And there are 3 questions. We will quickly show the results, and then I will hand it over to Karthik. Yes, sure. So can we see the result? How? Okay, so I think we will show the results after the panel discussion, but we will quickly move to the next question and the third question as well. So right now we are on, oh, people are still answering. Okay. Next question. So now there will be a next question on your screen. So please rank it accordingly, and then we will move to the third question. Hmm? 16. Okay. So people are still ranking, and I think we will give another 5-10 seconds, and then we will move into the third question. Yeah, third question? Okay. Yeah, I think the third question will be up on your screens. Maybe Karthik, you can take up the stage in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishwas, for taking us through that. Took a little longer than I think what we anticipated, but I think it went into the details so that everybody could appreciate it. Not all of us have sat through the multiple rounds of presentations you've made. Let me take the opportunity now to introduce some of the panelists who will sort of reflect on this and at the same time, discuss the next steps, so to say, on what industry can do and what other stakeholders can do to take these frameworks forward. First, I'd like to call on Mr. Shivakumar, who is the group head, as well as the is also the chair of the CII Agricultural Council. He's a group head for Agri and IT business at ITC. I'd like to next call on Ranjini Mukherjee, who is the Director of Research and Knowledge Management with CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Ranjini, please. I'd like to call on Ashish Chaturvedi, who is the Head of Action for Climate and Environment at UNDP. Ashish, welcome. We then have Amrita Golder, who is a Senior Fellow Energy and Climate Change Research at ICRIER, one of India's preeminent economic think tanks. We We also have Subrata Chakrabarti, who is Associate Director with WRI. Welcome, Subrata. And finally, last but not the least, we have Sukanta Kumar Sahu, who's Deputy General Manager with NABARD. Thank you, Sukanta. So we all heard Vishwas's presentation. First off, I'd like to apologize for showing up the way I have. I realize I'm the most casually dressed on stage, but there's a good reason for that. This was my adaptive response to the flood that happened yesterday in my locality. I had to jump over a drain and I had to prepare for it in my walk to the metro. So here I am. So Vishwas preparing myself for, I guess, a climate change world in the way I dress. But Sukanta, maybe you want to take your time to have a glass of water. So I don't think we can disagree with anything that Vishwas said there, right? There isn't any absolute truth when it comes to the frameworks that can be used to assess. It's general enough that can be adapted for multiple different sectors. But in your sense, given that you work on adaptation and sort of supporting adaptation financing as the nodal agency for Government of India on this, what do you see the role for these kinds of frameworks in enabling industry to think about how to prepare for climate risks? Yeah.
First of all, thanks for inviting us, and congratulations for coming out with such a good report. Of course, we will have to go through it. Good to see that in adaptation domain, we are trying to orient industry more. So there is need of private sector capital, and industry has a big role, and this could be a nudge for not only industry, financier, policymaker towards this. I have a few points. I believe this must have been covered. When we are talking about physical risk, there is, you can say, classify as acute, that is extreme due to extreme weather events, that comes very pronounced, and we have no other way rather than to go for it. And it is very much also takes the stakeholder into on the board. Very much appreciate. And there is another part is a chronic issue, like the trend, the heat waves goes, the trend, the rainfall goes, and maybe planning resilience towards chronic physical risk could be more, having more probable way of ascertaining. So that could be given due focus, I believe, other than acute, which has a big issue. Then comes nicely you have got for risk index. When you see the risk part, I feel the low-hanging fruit is exposure. And we have got good control. If I'm seeing the industry as a unit which I have control, I do not have much control on policy, regulation, hazard, or for that matter in the supply chain or value chain, how the vulnerability with the community or the sector as such is played. I do not have much control, but I have control over exposure. So some nuts could be there that these sectors and industries where like extreme events or for that matter chronic issues are there, and maybe exposure can be reduced in some way. That can be, could be possible. Then comes another part which will attract the policy makers about the how this sort of scenario, this sort of assessment of risk has a systemic risk. Be it coastal line area, you can put in the regional level, or you can put industry across industries or across financial sector, because these are like financial sector, industry go hand in hand. So if we can see that this particular area has a big systemic risk, then it becomes very easy for us to attract systemic address to that. So some of the policy level issues also you might have covered, but I will like to see if there is anything on water energy nexus. This is much influenced by our utility pricing, our policy issues which do not have much control, but it should have a say, must have been done. Plus, coming to the finance part, we have, people are going for green bonds, social bonds, or sustainability linked bonds. We do not get any premium advantage. We call it greenium, or for that matter. Because that, it's not that in Western countries, people are so keen to sacrifice their ROI. But basically, there is a regulatory requirement that a certain percentage of your portfolio should be green. So it's time that we take this issue to the regulators that, okay, they prescribe, apart from emission reduction requirement for industries, there should be for the investors also that this much should be a part of their portfolio, which will give us a little concessionality in our borrowing tool, like a green bond.
Thank you, Sukanta, for those quick reflections. We'll come back to you with the second round. It was just initial reflections because we've heard the framework, it's fresh in our minds. Amrita, I'll maybe turn to you, being a researcher in the space and having worked on similar issues. Again, a similar question. In terms of the framework, the way it's presented, do you see any obvious gaps in terms of, like Sukanta mentioned, that the focus perhaps was more on acute events, because of course it's driven by floods and hydromet disasters? Do you feel any other sort of gaps that could be addressed to make it more complete and relatable for stakeholders in the industry? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just quickly, excellent presentation, by the way, and I look forward to receiving the report and going through the same. ICRIER as such is also working on this. I am an economist by training, so most of the comments that I'll make would be in that vein in terms of that. So my first point that I was keenly listening to the presentation. First point that I want to make is this issue of, let me call it vision mismatch. The idea is that whenever we are talking about climate change, we are talking about things that may happen by 2030, 2050, 2070, 2100. But when a businessman is planning their day-to-day activities or even their corporate plans for maybe 5 years or 10 years going ahead, they may not obviously take a lot of this on board. So how do you sort of parcel out the impacts in sort of a time frame of impacts? So things that could manifest by 2030, how do you have resiliency against that? And similarly. The second point that I wanted to make, and I would sort of maybe a little contradictorily talk about the fact that right now, in my view, the focus needs to be on extreme events. So slow onset impacts like sea level rise, heat stresses, etc., are manifesting themselves and they need their sort of remedial measures, of course. But for extreme events, in terms of if you look at the damage costs that industry has to incur, so a cursory glance at maybe a data source like maybe the MDAT database, which talks about what each disaster has costed the economy. So you would see that floods and cyclones both have a very big, heavy economic toll every year for the economy. And going ahead, the frequency and the intensity is only going to increase. So if we have limited means and you would want to sort of prioritize on things that need to occur now versus things that could be planned for maybe later, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, getting prepared for floods and cyclones make better sense for me. The third thing that I want to talk about is, and I was actively participating in the survey, as a researcher working in this field, data is a big, big issue. Now, something that CEW has presented, and they were looking, I felt, more at past events. Now, what actually happens is that there is a lot of work that needs to happen. So I don't expect small industries to actually have the wherewithal to actually downscale climate models. So you have these global models across the entire globe, then you have to statistically or using other techniques downscale it for your region of interest, look at how trends have changed. So it's an entire big piece of work because different models talk about different things. You have to pick a correct ensemble, match it against past data, see if it reflects correctly. Then also what you essentially land up is temperature patterns and precipitation patterns. Those need to be sort of fed into larger models to look into what could possibly happen. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't expect small businesses to do all that. So when there was this question of dashboard, I expect a lot more. So I believe World Bank already has something called, let me get it correctly, they have something called Climate Change Knowledge Portal, which downscales some of the results, but they expect you to sort of take that data and work it with it in your system. ICRIA per se is trying to do some bit of flood forecasting as well as cyclone forecasting. So from that perspective, I know how difficult things are, because floods, just because you have precipitation patterns, you would not know the water volume, you would not know how the storm water drainage at a local level is, where the sort of depressions are, where the elevated areas are. So you need a lot of GIS and remote sensing work that needs to happen at the background to actually predict which are the areas that will be inundated.
Thank you. Sorry, I think we should do for a second round of comments.
Yeah,
We can probably come in,
sorry,
but thank you for that, Amrita, for bringing that to our attention. It sort of, I think, brings to the question that I had for Ranjini here. So I think when we were discussing outside, along the lines of what Amrita has just started talking about, which is on how do we ensure that this data that we're looking at, whether it is the forward-looking CMIP6 that's downscaled, how should that be made available to the industry as a whole, notwithstanding the portal that she referred to, the World Bank one. A lot of work still needs to be done to ensure that it's consumable at the level of an MSME or even a large industrial unit which may not have the capabilities in-house. So how is CDRI thinking about perhaps systems that would make this accessible and available in a way that the understanding is consistent across everybody else? There's no different interpretation. So Ranjini, yeah.
No, thank you. And if I may take 1 minute to kindly reflect on the findings of the report.
Please,
so, very quick reflection. I was very happy to see that resilient infrastructure is there, because the report clearly says that we need to invest on building resilience of infrastructure, and particularly it mentioned about power and telecom, because infrastructures are interconnected. And then a collapse of one infrastructure leads to another, and then there is a kind of a cascading impact into the entire supply chain. So it's very important, and it was very heartening to see that as a recommendation. The other recommendation is on the physical and climate risk assessment framework. So it doesn't talk about only having a framework, but I think the report talks about mainstreaming it, because we have been hearing this for almost last 10 years, that we need climate data, we need physical data. Now, how do we mainstream this whole framework? What exactly needs to be done? So, more interested to talk about the how part of it. So, that's the second. And then I also saw that there was a mention of asset level resilience. So, of course, it's very closely linked to what we talk about system level resilience for an infrastructure system. Now, coming to CDRI, CDRI has developed a global risk model, which is a probabilistic risk model, which looks at 6 different hazards and 8 different infrastructure sector. And kind of then, because it is probabilistic, it looks at several scenarios and kind of help countries at an aggregate level to understand the kind of risk that is embedded in the infrastructure sector. We call it contingent liability. And further, for better understanding of the policymakers, industries, and all other stakeholders, it also provides a financial metrics. So it gives you an average annual loss figure, so that you understand, okay, in my country, because of this 6 to 7 hazard, this is the kind of risk embedded in my infrastructure sector. And if I hit by these hazards and if it turns to a disaster, this is the kind of average annual loss I will incur, which is very good. It is a global tool. It has used all global models. Now, these needs to be downscaled at the country level. And when we go there, the how part of it comes. How do we do that? The major challenge is, in India, the disaster database system is very weak, because states were supposed to come up maintain their historical data. The picture actually varies. Tamil Nadu, Odisha will be better. You go to the northeastern part of India, you go to West Bengal, you will not find that. However, it is very good to see that very recently the National Disaster Management Act got amended, and it talks about a national database. So, one is the historical data. Getting the historical data on the disaster is a challenge. The second is the loss data. What you get today is the damage data. It's literally like so many kilometers of road got damaged, so this was the cost incurred, the lost amount lost. It is not the loss data. So loss data doesn't exist. So we need to build that data, because we need to look at both the damage and loss data. The third is, past is no more guidance for the future. So we need to do probabilistic modeling. Now, it's complex. The landscape in South Asia is not as developed as what you see in the other parts of the world. And then even if you do this probabilistic modeling, it needs ground truthing. Because then you need to go at the country level and actually see what the model says, whether it matches with what is actually happening on the ground, to actually gain the confidence of the policymakers to take some actions. Now, to do that matching, you still need a robust data system at the ground level. So these are some of the challenges which are existing. What CDRI is now planning to do is to downscale this GIRI model at the local level. So we plan to work with countries to provide them support to come up with a country-specific. Of course, our focus remains on infrastructure. We look at specific sectors. Global model looks at 8 sectors. When we go to a country, we will prioritize it. It will depend on the sectors that the country would like to prioritize and also the hazards the country that would like to prioritize. So that's one. And the other, and I'll stop after that, the other is also strengthening the overall policy and regulatory framework. And here I would like to give reference to the recent study we did in the state of Odisha on building resilience of their power sector. We looked at the transmission and distribution infrastructure, and we looked at those infrastructure which is located within 60 kilometers from the coast. Now, one of the findings, and the report is available in the public domain, if you have interest, you can access that, was that the wind zone map needs to be changed if you really want to make this infrastructure resilient. So that's a decision to be taken at the policy level, and it's a regulatory decision, right? Because the wind zone maps cannot be changed by the state government. They need to work with the BIS and other national government, the mandated agencies to change it. So this kind of changes is required at the regulatory and the policy level also when you actually talk about building resilience and even, generating data, because there is a change required even in the wind zonation map. So these are some of the challenges that exist on ground, which we are trying to address. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was very enlightening. So when you say wind zone maps, you're saying that ones that would influence how the infrastructure is actually created. So based on the wind zone map.
Yes, when you design your infrastructure, you look at these wind zone maps, right? You are designing it for an area which is highly prone to cyclones.
Sure.
Odisha is the Fani cyclone wind speed was more than 200 kilometers.
Right.
The last cyclone which hit the state. So currently, your wind zone map actually doesn't make that entire geography within that zone. So how do you design then?
Correct. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And just going back to the point, I quickly moved from Amrita, but want to acknowledge the point that you made about historic focus. I think security lies in terms of being able to understand the way your past has been, and I think that data is more certain. Going forward, I think the challenge really is that downscaling. In fact, we actually don't have India downscale data from CMIP 6 available that IITM has done. In fact, I think it's just coming out, is likely to. Is towards the end of this year. So we're still waiting for IITM to come out with that. So once that does, hopefully we'll have the best in-class downscale data. So I think we're realizing that. And I think the probabilistic assessment that she's talking about is very important because there is no certainty to any of this. And, perhaps preparation in excess of what is needed may also be a challenge. Ranjini brought about a point, and Subrata, I want to come to you on this. So she talked about the state government can't effectively take a stance on this, whereas it has to be a coordinated effort with BIS and the central entity. So even within states, so WRI of course works with cities on a lot of resilience. So which are the departments that you feel are typically the ones that are more eager to look at climate resilience and who've been more eager to engage? And how do you see their role in shaping how industries respond to this? Please.
Thank you, Karthik, and congratulations on the framework. It's very timely. I'll just make quick 3 points if I can reflect on the reports, which I really liked. When it comes to businesses and industries, there is this stark figure of rupees 1,434 billion that has come up in a CDP report, probably a report of 2021. I believe now that amount might have gone up, and this has been identified by the industries as a climate risk in the category of physical acute risk. So that is a reason enough to take an action with reference to resilience and all. Framework focuses on 5 indicators. I think the panelists, my fellow panelists, have spoken about it. I think adaptive capacity is something that I really liked. It is within the control of the industry. It is within the control of the policymakers. It is probably a good starting point for the industry to make structural and management process changes. The second thing is that the report provides an analysis of two sites in iron and steel sector, right? Most of the time what we have seen in these kind of frameworks is that we do not really provide, or we do not really get the flavor of the analysis that it can lead to. So providing this kind of analysis really gives an idea to the policymakers as well as the users as to how you can mainstream or use it. The third one, and I'm really very delighted to see that, it's that there are short-term and long-term recommendations even for small and medium-scale industries, which is often getting neglected. Right, and rightly mentioned, they do not have the capacity and capability to mainstream climate actions and disaster risk management into their own business agenda. Now, coming to your specific question of how it can be, what are the departments that can take care of this? We have been working with some of the states, say for example Kerala. We have very recently collaborated working in Bihar. What we have observed is that the short and sweet answer is Mausam Seva Kendra, which are there within the states, probably under planning and development department. They are, equipped or well positioned to take that. What probably would be required is the capacity building, not only in terms of the knowledge, but also in terms of the human resources. This is where they're really struggling. Apart from that, states have disaster risk management agencies. They are also well positioned. But what I also believe is that, and this is something that we have observed working in most of the states and cities, there is a lack of interdepartmental coordination. So that need to be fixed first, because all these things will boil down to the need of finance, right? So finance department need to be roped in so that these things can be mainstreamed into the state budgeting process at the first place. I'll stop here and looking forward.
Thank you, Subrata, for keeping that short. Ashish, then I guess that comes to you. You've been part of this NAP for what, a while now, right? In terms of the process, while you were at GIZ, I think GIZ was even supporting the development of it. It's still not public yet, right? Or is there a, not yet. So yeah, so if you can sort of fill us in on what's exactly the, the changing takes on how the country should adapt and the consequences for the frameworks that we've discussed today. Does the NAP sort of have such a nuanced take on what industry must do? So,
sure. Thanks very much and delighted to be here. So I think I'd like to start with sort of where Amrita started. Businesses have known how to invest under scenarios of uncertainty forever. So this is, so in 1994, there's an economist of Indian origin, Avinash Dikshit, who wrote a book about investment under uncertainty, right? And that option, the real option theory of investment, is pretty standard sort of textbook knowledge. Now, how does one start thinking about uncertainty in sort of a climate-constrained world or a climate-impacted world? And I think this is where a lot of the inputs that you hear and also the framework that you're talking about in terms of how do you inform decision-making by individual industries, by sort of groups of industries, by industrial associations, is something that we need to kind of start thinking about. And therefore, so I like what Vishwas was talking about in terms of frameworks which inform decision-making at various levels of agglomeration, right? So you can actually talk about a sort of a loosely sort of structured cluster, but then you can actually start thinking about industrial estates where there is significant policy input as well and policy design. So one of the things that I would recommend, and maybe this is something that you are considering already, is what are the policy entry points which are existing at the national and subnational level. So for instance, there is already an eco-industrial park guideline which has been floating around. So when I was in GIZ, we used to work on it. In Telangana, in Andhra Pradesh, and I'm sure there's a global framework as well. UNIDO, GIZ, and others have been involved in developing it, the Eco-Industrial Park Guideline Framework. So some of this can actually be embedded there. Then there is, of course, this zoning, Industrial Zoning Atlas, which was a work that CPCB started in late 80s. Excellent work, which was looking at sort of siting of industrial estates and industrial sort of clusters, my colleagues, and sort of that's sort of part of the curse of being in the same sector for too long. You're aware of these things developing. So that sort of area is also rather interesting. And then, of course, there is this entire work around siting guidelines as well. No? So they were initially thought of about the impact of industries on the environment, but how is the changing sort of climate impacting industry itself? That's something that one needs to start thinking of. At UNDP, we developed the, sort of for the state of Himachal, we developed the disaster management plan for the industrial, industrial districts and the Department of Industries. And that's work which is happening in other states as well, at the national level as well. The National Institute of Disaster Management developed the disaster management plan for lots of sort of line departments and line ministries. That's an area which is, again, an entry point where you will need some of these sort of metrics and to be sort of mainstreamed. On the NAP, a very specific question, the NAP has actually just started. So the adaptation communication, which was submitted last year in December at the COP, now the National Adaptation Plan is in the works. There is a separate working group which looks at disasters very specifically. There's another working group which is looking at poverty and sort of industrialization, economic. And so, of course, the industrial development will also be cross-cutting across multiple industries. And this is where lots of sort of aggregated work, I would say, at the policy level, which is going to emerge in the next few months. And so industry will be consulted at various sort of points. But having said that, I think it's very important to start thinking about mainstreaming this at the state and the sub-state level. Because, of course, you can have a national level framework, and this is where frameworks sort of remain frameworks a lot of the time. What you need is to find precisely the entry points at the level of consent. Well, all industry folks would know about consent to establish, consent to operate. So therefore, it's incumbent upon the state departments of environment, the state pollution control boards, the state disaster management authorities to provide that necessary input in forming industry. And of course, the industry will take its calculated risk, but that information should be made available publicly as much as possible.
Fantastic. I mean, I think, Ashish, you brought out a lot of things that obviously have been part of the way India's been thinking about it. Perhaps we've not yet done the right things in embedding them, as you said, for instance, in a CTO, right? How should you basically be thinking about it so that you're resilient to this? But also speaks to the point of, long-term versus acute, right? So as you're establishing, how do you ensure that you are preparing yourself for future ones as opposed to just being able to bear with the risks that come your way? So thank you for that. I guess now to the literal business end of the conversation where, we have the ITC representative here. And of course, you're from the Agri division, Shivakumar, and it's very different there. I mean, as they say, the farmer is perhaps the one that's taking the biggest risk with all his assets open to the vagaries of environment. So how do you think we can take a framework like this, which is, I'm guessing for a fenced out enterprise, right? Of course, the framework speaks more broadly about areas, but ultimately we're speaking about industrial units. But in agriculture itself, how do you see this playing out, and how do you think you can take this to your the hundreds of thousands of farmers that you work with? Yeah.
Yeah, I think firstly I must compliment both CEW and CII for getting a framework which probably work across sectors, including agriculture, but that's only at a broad level, like you mentioned. In each of the elements, there are some nuances that we must factor in when it comes to agriculture. When you say risk is hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, I think at that level, there'll be no difference for any sector. If you first look at the hazard itself, in agriculture, the threshold levels and range are far smaller at which the crops get impacted than establishments in industry or other offices and other segments will have an impact. If you have wind at a certain speed, taller plants will lodge much more quickly. And similarly, when you look at temperatures, until it hits 50, probably it's still all right to work with what we've been used to. But several crops then will move the minute it crosses 35 and so on, and some below 9. And so ranges and thresholds will be far finer in case of agriculture, and that is something that we must factor when we are applying this framework to agriculture. when it comes to exposure, the same parameters, the hazard parameters or weather parameters, have different impact on different crops and at what we call different phenological stages of a crop. So if it is raining today, for some crops it's actually positive, and for some other crops it's negative, that it actually has an impact on either yield or in terms of its quality. In terms of phenological stages, okay, there are multiple seasons in which different crops are planted and there's a crop cycle and you harvest. The same weather parameter will have different implication when you are planting, when the vegetative growth or flowering or a grain formation, or similarly at the time of harvest. And similarly in case of livestock and aquaculture have their own parameters. So therefore, how do you really assess at different phenological stages of different crops is the exposure element. That's the nuance which comes there. And I think finally when it comes to vulnerability, you started saying it, certainly the fact that the adaptation plans will need to be then executed on the ground by millions of farmers. It's not by a few thousands or hundreds of thousands of SMEs, but it's literally in millions of farmers who then obviously need to get informed and adaptation strategies brought in. Some of them could be preventive and no regret strategies, but many of them are things which need to be done on the go based on the short-term forecasts. I think that kind of nuances is what needs to be brought in, but ITC having done adaptation work for a while and very large, almost 3 million acres now of work, I can say that at a broad level, the framework works and it's nuances that you need to factor in, and then we'll be good to go in agriculture also.
Maybe I'll sort of start the second round. I think we have probably another 10 minutes. Aditya, do we have another 10 minutes possibly? Yeah? 5? 15 minutes. Okay, great. We've got 15 minutes. So maybe I'll start with you. So given that you've faced multiple events so far, right? What has been your learning? For instance, when I came for your session last year, your colleagues talked about the multiple days of production outages that you had. So in those sites, is your response typically site-specific, or are you then changing the way your entire business unit is responding to this, thinking that, this could happen anywhere else, and I am now having, let's say, a more rigorous process for, keeping check of what will happen under future instances across, or are you then basically just coping with it at a site level? How has your response typically been to this?
So the general approach that we've been following is it's a three-stage approach. When you start with the basic vulnerability assessment across all the sites, and we've done it for over 140 sites, talking about industry now and our hotel and those establishments, not about agriculture as much. In those kind of places, the vulnerability assessment is done at a high level in terms of which, like you have shown the India map, using, of course, far sharper AI-based tools to assess in terms of for each location, what kind of hazard that you are exposed to, and therefore, what's the vulnerability there. The next is that among those which are more vulnerable, then there is a deeper site-specific study in terms of what are the issues that one is facing. And then finally get to the site-specific work. But the minute you face something somewhere, and then you deal and cope with it at that point of time, and obviously that learning goes across, that, okay, something which is likely to face a similar kind of issue, then how do you really do the adaptation there also? So that's the kind of work which...
Can you think of an example of something that you maybe picked up across two different sites based on something that a particular site faced, a change that you brought up?
Yeah, the flooding, for example. One of the earlier stages where we had the flooding impact was in Bhadrachalam, one of the paperboard facility, and it's by the side of the river because obviously it's a water-consuming facility. And all the work which is done there, obviously relevant to that topography in terms of what kind of retaining walls, where is the equipment kept, and what are the kind of different machinery which is kept in different locations and all of that. Based on the experience that is taken from there, when you're building another factory in Nadiyad, for example, in Gujarat, with a similar kind of conditions. So all of that was factored in, and we just had recently floods in Gujarat. And so some of those were really shown as how the result was much better because that was taken care. Notwithstanding, of course, there are other local factors that we learned afresh and then say how do you take it in a different kind of location.
Interesting. Good to hear that. Good to hear that. Ashish and perhaps to Sukanta, both of you, in the National Adaptation Plan, or be it any framework which then talks about the means to actually adapt, what do you think we can actually put in place through the use of such frameworks in ensuring that the financing that goes in? I mean, I'm not sure to what extent industry will be a beneficiary of financing that's there because that will obviously be development focused. But how do we then effectively drive financing and indeed insurance, right, in a way that it speaks to and incentivizes folks to take into account resilient planning? Yeah.
So I think there is, of course, in the NAP, there is going to be a chapter on adaptation resourcing, like where are the resources that are going to be mobilized for the implementation of the plan. And in fact, UNDP with the Ministry of Finance, the Department of Economic Affairs, we're also developing a resource mobilizing framework on climate finance, which looks at sort of 4 different sources: private domestic, private international, public domestic, and public international. And a large part on adaptation, of course, historically has been coming from the public sources. Of course, the private sector can benefit from it in terms of what preparatory work, what adaptation measures you put in place. And I think also in the areas of sort of frameworks, for instance, which will be largely financed by public monies, be it international or domestic. Like, for instance, we've done this sort of developed platform for data innovation for climate resilient agriculture, which basically looks at, and this started in Telangana with the Telangana government, and we have multiple layers of data. It's like an agri-stack, essentially, looking at how certain parts of the agri ecosystem, even going to the farm level details, why certain farms are performing better than others, depending on the choice of, and then you go to ground truth and ask them what kind of package of practices did you adopt to kind of have these kinds of impacts that have been created. And that's a collaboration with NABARD already, because we developed it as a sort of a initiative of the UNDP, but then we handed it over to NABARD, and now we are working together to expand the use case of it. So this is another example where we started it off through sort of, core resources of UNDP, but then handed it over to the National Bank of India to now start expanding it to other sort of areas. Now, in terms of sort of international finances on adaptation, there's very limited funding which is flowing in, and even less of that is actually coming to the private sector as far as adaptation finance is concerned. But there is some good news, right? So SIDBI has mobilized a massive GCF grant of 250, well, not a grant, it's a $250 million allocation, which is grant come sort of loan, largely loan, but it is targeting MSMEs for both mitigation as well as adaptation. So it's a big sort of initiative, and I think one can actually hear more and more. So therefore, I would also encourage the private sector to come up with interesting ideas. Avana Capital has also got a $25 million sort of allocation from the GCF, which is looking at early stage sort of startups and venture capitalists as well. So there is some sort of flow of finances, and I think there's a massive capacity, and we run a GCF readiness project in India as well with the Ministry of Environment, which has a very strong focus on private sector. So we'd be delighted to work with colleagues who are sitting here as well.
Just very quickly, given that the UN has presence across different countries, do you feel that India's approach to financing for climate adaptation is any different given our vulnerability in structure as compared to maybe the developed world? I mean, I know the developed world insurance is far more entrenched. Perhaps it's left to a market-based mechanism. Do you see that trend happening within India, or do you feel we'll still be reliant on sort of development financing in the way that you've talked about right now?
So, well, the insurance industry has had its experiences in India, and of course, sort of early on, sort of one of the sort of discussions that we used to have about how do you entice the private sector into adaptation, the industry that came to mind was the insurance sector, right? Sort of, if the insurance sector could be the big capital which drives narratives on adaptation. Now, sort of as long as you have significant state presence on insurance, I think that sort of challenge will remain, right? And I was in Himachal last week, talking about there. So we're developing a human development report for the state of Himachal with a focus on climate change. And there are, so not only Himachal, but several other states in India which have significant negative experiences with insurance as well. And maybe in agriculture insurance itself, there are lots of challenges which exist. In fact, we run the PMU of the PMFBY. UNDP works very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture in the PMFBY, and if you look at the overall landscape of agriculture insurance itself, there are many challenges there. So I think, of course, there is a developed world narrative on insurance. I think for good reason, some experiences, we need to actually have maybe assurance facilities at subnational level, not necessarily insurance facilities, which are targeting the the marginal farmers as well as the small and medium enterprises, and not expecting them to fully transfer the risk, because it is going to get lesser and lesser possible to transfer the risk in any case.
Absolutely. I think all fantastic thoughts, Ashish. I know Ashish may have already overlapped and said a lot of the stuff that you may want to do, Sukanta, but if you wanted to add on to any of those,
I'd like
please.
to supplement here that we have submitted one small concept note, especially for insurance sector for a farm, which looks for peril-based incidents plus looking beyond PMFB and all that. So it will be equity and all that. So coming to the first part, what he was asking about finance and all that. Adaptation as such is able to draw lesser finance. So what we are trying to do,
lesser finance?
Compared to, like if you say 25% of our whole climate action requirement is flowing, financed in India, something like 11%, 10% is towards adaptation. Maybe $5 billion was in 2020. So what is the problem? Problem is not only long gestation period, MRV issue, and all those things. Basically, we are looking for that the buzzword is blending. So how to blend financially, it finally boils down to ROI and all. So if you see even GCF, 782 million flow is there to India, not more than 20% will be grant. So if at all finance is flowing, it's not just a grant is a very small component. So equity, loan and all that coming. So how to blend so that private sector is also associated. Like Goa has come out with a blend finance facility. Now, not only blending as far as financial instruments are concerned, so it is high time that we blend the sectors. How I call it, like include agrivoltaics. So adaptation, which is primarily a little not a so viable proposition, if we can suitably include some solar solutions like DRE and all that, we can make a meaning to it and it can be done. So many MDVs, FAO, ADB, World Bank, all we are in talks with them, and we have already designed certain products where different mix of financial instruments, and for that matter, even carbon market, if you can monetize that one. We can, hedging is a big issue. We are looking for a synthetic product for hedging so that it will reduce the landing cost. Because even though we get, if you do not get sub 2% ROI from international level, hedging, country guarantee and all that goes, it doesn't compete with SDL. Very difficult to push. So we are looking forward to that scenario. Apart from that, flow in adaptation sector is flowing. Like we have almost 800 million US dollar. We have already put in this watershed development, tribal development like agroforestry model through climate proofing measures. Apart from other infrastructure support, what we do, like 6,000 crore infrastructure we are given for solar pumps across India. So these are things in the pipeline. We are looking forward to further private sector collaboration, and people are ready. We need to little rejig our system so that we can put more finance to the adaptation sector.
Thank you, Sukanta. To both Ranjini and to Amrita, the question that I have is both of you referred to the need to look ahead and not look at the past, and you refer to uncertainty and probabilistic assessments. Big words, right? Unfortunately, we've never been the best at uncertainty-related assessments. You look at any of these publications typically, and I would argue for good reason, because we are unsure about our uncertainties, are talking about very static representation. So from a methodological perspective, how do you ensure that Indian stakeholders are more attuned to living in this uncertain world and also talking in uncertain terms, right? Because it has implications for things like insurance payouts. So while we want a certainty, we know that it's always going to be based on these probabilistic events and, and what qualifies as something that deserves a payout. So if you can
Yeah.
tell us how CDRI plans to address that or maybe imbibe that spirit.
Yeah, so very quick reflection. So as I said, we need to have a balanced approach because probabilistic modeling will help you to understand, it will provide you future-facing information. But as I said, when you go at the state level or at the local level to kind of build the narrative, okay, this is the risk and so these are the measures we have to take, it needs ground truthing. Now, how that ground truthing happens is when you systematically build your damage and loss data. Currently, we don't have it. So then the ground truthing can happen, like your assessment, probabilistic assessment is giving you this scenario. However, you match it up with the historical data, which is largely deterministic modeling. Through that, you get a data, right? That, okay, fine, this is the scenario. And then when it comes to resilience planning, there are many other factors to be kept in mind. Often there is an incremental approach towards it. You really cannot achieve everything at a go. You start planning in a phased manner. But you still need the data to take that risk-informed decision. So, and here I think private sector can also play a very important role because private sector itself can contribute towards developing some of these products, be it early warning system, climate information services, insurance products. So they also have a role in this while they're the user of that data for doing planning at their own level so that their businesses are risk informed, their supply chains are less interrupted when there is a major hazard. But at the same time, they can contribute in this space. And other point I would like to mention, it is very important to look at extreme events, but probably it is also important to look at moderate scale, regular events that is happening year after year, because that really helps you to build that narrative for the future. So you get a picture through the probabilistic assessment, you get a picture through your regular capturing of data on an yearly basis, because every state is being hit by, if you look at the heat wave data for this year, it has been huge. So if you start building upon that data, you then can have a balanced approach towards decision making.
Yeah, got it. Obviously, I think we want to spend some time with the audience also putting in some questions. So, Amrita, if you can quick reflections and maybe a final thing to Subrata as well.
Two quick reflections and some shameless self-promotion to go with it. So first is, let me talk about this point about damage data being available and loss data not being available. So as researchers, it is our role to sort of try and unearth unexplored avenues. So I, along with certain co-authors, we have actually used Pravis data. So Pravis is a data set that compiles company financial statements for all the industries. So what we've tried to do is specifically for the cyclone instance, so we looked at the time frame of 2002 to 2019. There were, I believe, 23 cyclones that happened in India. And per cyclone, how much did it cost the firm or on an average? So what we find is that for losses, so we've taken two metrics. One is sales loss and one is asset loss. So we find that per cyclone, it has costed the firm 6% decrease in sales and 2% loss in asset. And that asset loss is not just 1 year, it has an impact in the next year as well. So there is obviously a large impact that we're talking about. And second, about probabilistic model, it's interesting, we worked on that too. And using a hazard, a Cox model, proportional hazard model, we've looked at what is the survival rate of firms following a cyclone instance. Therefore, and it doesn't hit across the board. The larger firms are obviously more likely to survive. It is the smaller guys. So there is a big dip in their survival rates, as you find. And one could use Pravis as well as ASI, which is Annual Survey of Industries, to actually follow that if there is a cyclone or flood instance, how does company profits and other things change? So that is point number one. Point number two is with respect to NAP, because it's been talked about again and again. So ICRIER would also sort of try and do its bit. So we are the anchoring research institute for the chapter on adaptation resourcing that Ashish was talking about. So it is not just about estimation, what would be needed from both the private as well as the public side, but also on how it would be raised. So that is, I think, a bigger question than just telling how much is needed. Because for UNFCCC and climate negotiations, giving out the amount is part of the strategy, but also how to plan for it financially. So insurance obviously is a big thing. And also, in fact, I will very keenly look at the interventions you have suggested to look at how much it would cost in terms of if they were implemented on ground and build that in.
Thank you so much, Amrita. Really appreciate that. Subrat, I'm going to make your job easier and give you the first question that comes from the audience. Is that a good one to go? All right, great. So, let's take a few questions from the audience and then see which ones we can field. But yeah, just briefly identify yourself. No comments, just quick questions, please. Yeah.
My name is Ankit. I'm a co-founder, CEO of a climate tech firm that works on climate risk, specifically for financial institutions. My question is about forward-looking climate risk. See, mostly when you model climate risk, 5 years, 10 years, you're looking at long-term assets, you assume certain scenarios. These scenarios are largely available from IPCC, NGFS, and others. In most of those scenarios, they use a fairly developed market view of how our economy decarbonizes. They use carbon prices, for example, which, at least in India, are not applicable. Have you seen better types of scenarios available which can help us model climate risk a lot more accurately in India? Because while we can do today, if we have to predict future, we need much better, more localized scenarios.
Thank you, Ankit, for that fantastic question. Can we take another as well? I saw maybe one other hand go up somewhere. There's one there. Yeah, please. The gentleman in the back, can somebody hand him a mic?
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, my name is Rohit from Precision Grow, Mumbai. We are agriculture-based, sustainable agriculture-based company. So my question is to Ashish sir. In last 4 years, 4 years ago, right, we had a situation like COVID. So it was a very drastic situation, critical situation. But still, it had one silver lining that we saw the air pollution level decreased as we all were locked down. And Ganga River, right, we saw the purity of Ganga River water that time. So I somewhere believe that, right, nature soothes itself, it heals itself. So can we take this as a measure, like we are developing some kind of technology where we, as a human, we doesn't exist for nature. Can we develop such a kind of a system? So that is my one question.
Very quickly, please.
Yeah. That's it.
Okay, great. So you're basically saying, can we develop systems that allow for nature to sort of respond in its own way to, well, I'm not sure whether it's adaptation focused, but maybe building more resilience to the way we live. Subrata, do you want to field any one of those questions? Maybe the second one, because I know WRI has a big urban resilience program, which is nature-based, so yeah.
Yeah, maybe I think there are people who can comment on the forward-looking modeling first.
Sure.
I can come back
Sure,
later
okay.
if required.
Ranjini, if you want to take the first question from Ankit, yeah.
So just let me tell you that we work on infrastructure resilience. So our focus is resilient infrastructure. The model that we have used is actually looked at two boundaries, the lower boundary and the upper boundary as per the UNFCCC, the IPCC report, and we have done the modeling. It's a global tool, as I said. Now, when we go to at the country level, then we actually will work with the country government to decide on the scenarios that they would like to kind of consider for doing the modeling. So that has been our approach. And the focus is very much on only on infrastructure sector. So we look at 8 infrastructure sectors and 6 hazards. And so basically the impact of hazards and climate change on infrastructure. That has been our scope.
Sorry, you can correct me. I believe when we talk about scenario analysis, if it is physical risk, if it is not beyond 50 years or long horizon, it doesn't make any certain difference, significant difference. So scenario analysis could be good for transition risk mapping and doing corrective measures, if I'm not wrong.
So for our modeling, I just clarify, like for impact of cyclones and other, we have even looked up to 150 years, using different kind of scenarios. So it's available in public domain. If you're interested, we can share the link with you just to have an understanding how it has been done. But it has looked at multiple scenarios, even up to 150 years, particularly for cyclone and many other climate-related hazards like flooding, cyclone, and landslides, etc.
Yeah,
Because it's a great
so-
question.
Yeah, so actually, when we are looking at risks per se, and let me talk about it from the hat that I'm wearing as somebody who's contributing to NAP. So the impacts will be different for different sectors, and how the equation, essentially the risk and how it enters into the production function, so that will be different for each of the sectors. So what we have to do is basically now, let me sort of spill the beans a little. So when we're looking at scenarios, one of the scenarios we obviously look at is the extreme one. But also, maybe within the sort of middle two scenarios, we probably will take something that steers a little moderate in the sense. So right now, when we're talking about forecasting, we will be using two scenarios to model if things go all right and you don't have too much of a impact that will happen, so you will sort of steer the moderate way. But if climate change manifests itself much sooner than expected and you have all of these sort of extreme events happening, then you take that production function, that extreme scenario. But how they manifest themselves in each of the production function will be different. Different parameters will be needed. So for example, for agriculture, we might take temperature, we might take some precipitation or extreme rainy day. For health, you would have the number of rainy days because that will obviously increase mosquitogenic conditions. So it will be different for each. I think once the NAP comes out, there will be an annexure to the study where we will be providing how each of these climate scenarios entered into the projections and in the scenario building, and how this sort of had an impact on how much it would cost to build resiliency into the system.
I think this could be a discussion on its own, to be honest. We should definitely do this bilaterally afterwards. Ashish, you want to quickly weigh in before I leave the last word to Subrata on the second question, please?
Yeah, so I think coupled with sort of these expert-based modeling exercises, I think it's also worthwhile to engage in stakeholder-based scenario planning exercises. So there is really good work, sort of, for instance, Stanford did this really nice sort of report on scenarios for the future for the solar industry a few years ago, right? And brilliant work in terms of sort of just thinking about involving all kinds of different knowledge systems, not only top-down modeling sort of knowledge, but also bottom-up knowledge which exists in communities. And you can actually create at different scales. So you can actually do it at the level of the state, you can actually do it at the level of a district, or even at an ecosystem level, and identify sort of critical uncertainties, and on the basis of those, sort of identify multiple scenarios and pathways going forward, some of which are desirable and some which are undesirable. And so there is lots of work which is done on foresighting, which is quite interesting beyond the sort of work which is on modeling. On the Mumbai, well, sort of this COVID, and so I actually wrote an op-ed 4 years ago in the Hindustan Times on how we could see the Dhauladhar range from Delhi and so on, from Chandigarh and so on and so forth. Of course, there was like sort of, that was, we don't want to be in a lot of certain situations, those kinds of situations, by sort of an act of God or by an act of pandemic. I think it's important to actually start thinking about how we have sort of creative interventions which use the power of nature to start thinking about better adaptation possibilities. I'm sure Subrata is going to talk about it, so I'll hand over to him.
I don't think anything else is left to be said, and I'm seeing Karthik is receiving chits, so maybe we can talk bilaterally about it.
No, but it should be based on at least the urban NBS work, if you want to comment.
On urban NBS work, yes, like there is a possibility, but then, you know, I truly believe that there is a dearth of finance in order to sort of mainstream this, you know, blue-green economy into the existing infrastructure. So until and unless we solve this finance puzzle, and it always boils down to the finance, until and unless we solve the finance puzzle, I'm really happy somebody spoke about carbon market. Nobody speaks about carbon market nowadays. That's an excellent platform. I do believe that carbon markets cannot go on and on. You know, it's a short-term effort, but at least it will help mainstreaming this, nature-based solutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Subrata, for being brave enough to sort of have the final word on this very rich discussion. I was given notes to basically try and summarize it, but I'm not even going to attempt it. I think all of you know what your main takeaways are. I think the question that you posed pretty much is, I think, at the forefront of what we should be working on next. Thank you so much for raising that at the end. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to the audience. Maybe a round of applause for all our panelists here. for being gracious with our time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Dear participants, with this we come to the end of this session. Our sincere gratitude goes out to all the speakers for making this an extremely engaging discussion. I kindly request our speakers to gather for a group photograph. Now we will have two parallel sessions running. In this hall, we will have a session on water, the essence of life, and in Sovereign 2, we will have a session on financing for transition. Interested delegates for the financing session, please move to Sovereign 2. Rest of you, please remain in this hall.
Please allow some time. Yeah.